In the velvet-hushed atmosphere of the lounge onyx, Yolanda Peterside was more than a waitress. She was a ghost in a starch-white shirt. To the elite of Seoul who frequented this dimly lit sanctuary, she was part of the furniture, as unremarkable as the mahogany bar or the heavy silk curtains. They saw her skin, a deep, rich obsidian that stood out in the sea of pale faces, but they rarely saw her. Yolanda didn't mind the invisibility. In fact, she curated it. She had learned early on that in a city where she was a permanent outsider, her survival depended on her ability to observe without being observed. As she glided across the polished floor, her movements were a study in silent efficiency. She refilled crystal glasses and cleared bone china plates with a touch so light it barely disturbed the air. Her father, a former high-ranking diplomat, had taught her that the most powerful weapon in any room wasn't a gun, but the ability to read the unspoken. "Look at the hands, Yolanda," he used to whisper. "The mouth can lie, but the hands always tell the truth." Tonight, as the scent of expensive tobacco and aged whiskey swirled around her, Yolanda's eyes were at work. She watched the way a young heir's fingers trembled as he signed a contract, signaling a desperate debt. She noted the way a politician leaned just an inch too close to a woman who wasn't his wife. She was a collector of secrets, cataloging the micro-expressions of the powerful from beneath her lowered lashes. But her focus kept drifting to the table in the corner, the one occupied by Kyung Cho and his wife, Kim. Kyung sat with the terrifying stillness of a predator at rest. His navy suit was sharp enough to cut, and the tattoos creeping up his neck spoke of a life forged in violence, yet his demeanor was ice cold. He was a man used to being the most dangerous thing in any room. Across from him, Kim Cho was his perfect mirror, an elegant vision of poise in a red off-shoulder dress that looked like a blooming poppy against the dark wood of the lounge. To anyone else, they were the ultimate power couple, enjoying a quiet dinner. However, as Yolanda approached to refresh their water, her internal alarm began to chime. She saw Kim's hand reach for her small silver-backed mirror on the table. It was a subtle movement most would dismiss as vanity, but Yolanda noticed the angle. Kim wasn't checking her lipstick. She was adjusting the glass to catch the reflection of the streetlights through the window. A flash of light hit the glass and bounced back. Once, twice, a signal. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of professional serenity. She looked past the glass, through the window, to a black sedan idling at the curb. The tinted window was rolled down just a fraction, the glint of metal visible in the shadows. The air in the lounge suddenly felt heavy, charged with the static of an impending storm. Yolanda knew that in less than 5 minutes, the man in the navy suit would be dead, and the woman in red would be a widow by design. She turned away, her tray balanced perfectly on her fingertips. She was just a waitress, an observer, an outsider. She could walk to the kitchen, clock out, and disappear into the Seoul night. But as she felt Kyung's cold, authoritative presence behind her, she realized she couldn't let the silence win. Not tonight. The air in the lounge onyx grew thick, vibrating with a frequency only Yolanda seemed tuned to. To the other diners, Kim Cho was merely a portrait of grace, her long black hair cascading over the silk of her red off-shoulder dress as she laughed at something her husband said. But Yolanda, standing by the service station with a linen cloth draped over her arm, saw the performance for what it was, a burial shroud woven from charm. She tracked the woman in red through the mirrors that lined the lounge walls. Kim's composure was too perfect, her posture too rigid. Every few seconds, Kim's fingers would ghost over the stem of her wineglass, tapping a rhythmic staccato code that didn't match the tempo of the jazz. Then came the second signal. Kim reached into her clutch, pulled out a gold lighter, and set it on the table. She didn't light a cigarette. She simply aligned the base of the lighter with the edge of the silver-backed mirror she had adjusted moments before. Yolanda's breath hitched. From her vantage point, she saw the geometry of betrayal. The lighter acted as a focal point, and the mirror was the lens. Outside, in the darkness of the Seoul street, the black sedan had moved. It was no longer idling. It had drifted into a precise line of sight with the table. Kim Cho leaned forward, her expression softening into a look of scripted devotion. She reached across the table and placed her hand over Kyung's tattooed knuckles. It was a gesture of intimacy, but Yolanda saw the truth in the tension of Kim's thumb. She was anchoring him. She was holding him in the kill zone, making sure his chest remained square to the window. Kyung Cho, the man who supposedly ruled the city's shadows, seemed oblivious, his cool demeanor unruffled. He took a sip of his whiskey, his gaze fixed on his beautiful, treacherous face. He was a lion being led to the high grass by a mate he trusted, and the silence of the room felt like a scream in Yolanda's ears. Yolanda looked at the other staff. They were busy with the mundane, polishing silver, pouring tea, chasing tips. They didn't see the way the light from the street lamps glinted off the long, dark barrel, now protruding an inch from the sedan's window. They didn't see the way Kim Cho's eyes darted toward the exit, calculating her own path of escape once the glass shattered.
This wasn't just a robbery or a warning. This was an execution, choreographed by the person closest to the target. Yolanda felt a cold sweat break across her skin beneath her professional white shirt. The invisibility she had cherished now felt like a cage. If she stayed silent, she was an accomplice to a murder. If she spoke, she was a dead woman walking. She looked at her order pad. Her hands, usually steady as a surgeon's, shook. She realized that the dangerous room she had spent years learning to read had finally presented her with a page she couldn't just turn. The red dress wasn't just a fashion choice. It was the color of the blood that was seconds away from staining the white linen of Table 3. Yolanda tucked the pen into her apron, her mind racing. She had to move. She had to break the dance. The observer was about to become the protagonist. Yolanda ducked behind the service station, the plastic spine of her order pad digging into her palm. Her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches, but her hands, trained by years of serving the most demanding elite, remained deceptively still. She pulled a pen from her apron. She didn't have time for a letter. She had seconds to distill a life-or-death warning into a single sentence. The pen scratched urgently against the paper. Your wife sold you out. You are surrounded. She tore the slip of paper from the pad. The sound of the perforation felt like a gunshot in the quiet luxury of the lounge. She folded it twice, a small, sharp-edged square of white that felt as heavy as lead. If she was caught with this, there would be no explanation that could save her. To Kim, she would be a meddling witness to be silenced. To Kyung, she might be mistaken for a participant in the hit, a distraction meant to lower his guard. Yolanda smoothed her apron and stepped back into the light. She began the choreographed walk she had performed 1,000 times, but this time the floor felt like a tightrope. She picked up a fresh bottle of sparkling water, the glass cold against her skin, and moved toward Table 3. Her peripheral vision was a radar, tracking the world outside the window. The black sedan had edged forward. The barrel was steady now. Kim Cho was still smiling, her hand still anchored on Kyung's wrist, her thumb pressing down with the weight of a countdown. Yolanda's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her white shirt. She arrived at the table. Kyung didn't look up. His attention was caught in the web of his wife's practiced gaze. Yolanda leaned in, the neck tattoos on Kyung's collar visible just inches away, inked dragons that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his carotid artery. "More water, sir?" she asked. Her voice was a miracle of professional calm, though her throat felt like it was filled with dry sand.
Before I tell you what happened next to Yolanda, don't forget to like this video, hit the subscribe button, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's dive into it. As she tilted the bottle over his glass, she used the bulk of her body to shield the view of the street and, more importantly, the view of Kim Cho. With her left hand, the one hidden by the shadow of the table's edge, she let the note slide from her fingers. It landed with a soft, silent thud on the navy fabric of his thigh. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Kyung's hand, which had been reaching for his glass, froze mid-air. He felt the weight of the paper. He didn't jump. He didn't look down. His cool demeanor didn't shatter. But Yolanda saw the subtle shift in his eyes, a sharpening, a sudden transition from a man at dinner to a man at war. Yolanda didn't linger. She placed the bottle on the table with a soft click and stepped back, her eyes meeting Kyung's for a fraction of a second. In that look, she shed her invisibility. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a warning. She retreated toward the kitchen, her skin crawling with the sensation of a target on her back. Behind her, she heard the soft rustle of paper as Kyung's hand dropped to his lap. The trap was still set, the sniper was still waiting, and the woman in red was still smiling, but the silence of the lounge onyx was about to be broken forever. Kyung Cho did not flinch. As Yolanda retreated toward the kitchen, her heart thundering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, she stole one last glance over her shoulder. The small square of paper lay unfolded in Kyung's lap. His eyes had scanned the words with the speed of a predator identifying a scent, but his face remained a mask of terrifying navy-suited calm. Beside him, Kim Cho was still the picture of a devoted wife, her fingers tracing the rim of her wineglass. She didn't notice the way Kyung's hand slowly moved from his lap to the heavy silverware on the table. She didn't notice the way his neck tattoos seemed to tighten as he flexed his jaw. Then the world broke. Kyung didn't dive for cover. He moved with the explosive precision of a spring-loaded blade. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the heavy glass water bottle Yolanda had just placed on the table and hurled it with devastating force, not at the window, but at his wife's head. Kim shrieked, ducking instinctively as the bottle shattered against the wall behind her, the sound acting as a countersignal to the hitmen outside. The first bullet arrived a microsecond later. Crack! The reinforced glass of the lounge onyx spiderwebbed but held, the sniper's aim thrown off by Kyung's sudden violent movement. Kyung didn't wait for a second shot.
He lunged across the table, his hands snapping around Kim's elegant throat, using her own body as a human shield as he dragged her toward the floor. "You should have aimed for the heart, Kim," Kyung's voice growled, low and lethal, cutting through the sudden screams of the other patrons. Panic erupted like an overturned hive. Guests scrambled under cables, the smell of cordite and expensive perfume mixing in the air. From the shadows of the lounge, Kyung's own men, the shadows that usually stood behind him, emerged with silenced pistols drawn. They didn't fire at the window. They fired at the entrance, where two men in leather jackets had just burst through, their weapons raised. Yolanda pressed her back against the kitchen door, her breath coming in gasps. Through the chaos, she saw Kyung rise from the floor, his eyes fixed on the window where the black sedan was already peeling away, its tires screeching against the sole pavement. He looked down at his wife, who was sobbing in a heap of crumpled red silk. Then he looked across the room. His gaze found Yolanda. In the wreckage of the lounge, amidst the shattered crystal, the spilled wine, and the ringing silence that follows a gunshot, the invisible observer and the Mafia boss locked eyes. There was no gratitude in his expression yet, only a dark, burning curiosity. He looked at the woman in the black and white uniform as if seeing a ghost that had suddenly gained flesh and bone. The shattered glass was more than just a broken window. It was the end of Yolanda's life as a waitress.
As the sirens began to wail in the distance, she realized that the man in the navy suit wasn't going to let her return to the shadows. She had saved the king, and in his world, that made her his most valuable and most dangerous asset. The sirens were still a distant wailing promise when the heavy hand landed on Yolanda's shoulder. It wasn't the police, it was Kang, the man with the shadow-still eyes who had stood behind Kyung-cho all evening. Without a word, he guided her away from the kitchen door and toward the rear exit, his grip firm but not bruising. Yolanda didn't resist. She knew the geography of this world well enough to know that the police were a secondary power tonight. The black sedan waiting in the alley was different from the one that had held the sniper. This one was sleek, armored, and smelled of expensive leather and gun oil. She was ushered into the back seat, flanked by 2 silent sentries, and driven through the neon-veined streets of Seoul in a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight.
They arrived at a brutalist villa tucked into the hills of Seongbukdong. The interior was all polished concrete and floor-to-ceiling glass, overlooking the city like a fortress. Yolanda was led to a cavernous office where Kyung sat behind a desk of petrified wood. He had discarded his navy jacket. His white shirt was rolled up to his elbows, revealing the full complexity of the dragons coiled around his forearms. Standing in a corner, looking disheveled and terrified, was Kin. Her red dress was torn at the shoulder. Her poise vanished. She looked less like a queen and more like a broken doll. "Sit," Kyung commanded. His voice was like grinding stones. Yolanda sat. She kept her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, her expression returning to that mask of professional seriousness she had worn as a waitress. For an hour, Kang interrogated her. He didn't use violence, but his questions were surgical. How did you know? Where did you see the signal? Who do you work for? Who paid you to notice? "No one pays me to notice," Yolanda said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still humming in her veins. "I am a waitress. People forget I have eyes because they are too busy looking at the menu. I saw the mirror. I saw the car. I saw a man who was about to be killed by the woman he was feeding." At this, Kyung looked up. He stared at her for a long time, his gaze dissecting her. He saw the attentive nature her father had cultivated, the sharpness behind her immigrant's caution. He looked at the woman in red, who let out a jagged sob, and then back at the waitress. "My wife thinks I am a monster," Kyung said quietly, standing up and walking toward Yolanda. "Perhaps I am, but a monster appreciates a certain kind of clarity. You had no reason to risk your life for mine. You are an outsider here. You could have let the glass shatter and walked away." He stopped directly in front of her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, crumpled note Yolanda had written. He smoothed it out on the desk. "You saved more than my life tonight, Yolanda Peterside. You saved my empire from a transition it wasn't ready for." He leaned in, his cool demeanor softening into something resembling genuine respect. "Thank you." The word felt alien in the room. Kyung turned to Kang. "She is not to return to that lounge. It is no longer safe for her. Pay off her debts, clear her records, and tell her that from tonight she is no longer a ghost." Yolanda felt the air finally return to her lungs. The interrogation was over, but as she looked at Kyung's tattoos, she realized the debrief was merely an audition. She had entered the villa a suspect, but she was leaving it as something far more complicated, a woman to whom the king owed a debt.
In the days that followed, the luxury of the Songbukdong villa began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded observation deck.
Yolanda was moved into a guest suite that overlooked the sprawling courtyard, a room filled with heavy silks and quiet air. But the silence was deceptive. From her balcony, she watched the shadows, Kyung's men, moving with a new, frantic purpose, their voices low and their hands never far from their holsters. The fallout of the dinner at the lounge Onyx had rippled through the city's underworld like a seismic shock. But inside the villa, the most chilling change was the presence of Kim Cho. She was no longer the radiant queen in the red off-shoulder dress. She had become a literal shadow, confined to the north wing of the estate. Yolanda occasionally caught glimpses of her through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the hallway, a pale, ghost-like figure staring out at the gardens she was no longer permitted to walk in. One evening, as Yolanda was being led to the dining hall by Kang, they passed the library. Through the cracked door, she heard Kyung's voice, devoid of the gratitude he had shown her. It was cold, sharp, and focused on logistics. He was speaking to a group of men about cleaning the slate. Yolanda called mentions of shipping routes, overseas accounts, and names that were whispered with a reverence that bordered on fear. This was her first true glimpse into the inner workings of the empire she had inadvertently saved. It wasn't just about violence. It was a vast, intricate machine of data and influence. Maps were spread across the mahogany tables, and digital monitors flickered with stock market feeds and security footage from half a dozen countries. She was the only one who knew the frequency of the jammers, Kyung's voice referring to Kim. She didn't just want me dead, she wanted the transition to be total. She sold the blueprints to the Busan docks. The fallout hit Yolanda with a physical weight. Kim's betrayal hadn't been an act of passion, it was a corporate takeover written in blood. The woman in red had been willing to dismantle an entire network, a system that supported thousands of lives, just to seize the crown. Kang noticed Yolanda lingering and gently nudged her forward. He didn't look at her with the suspicion of an interrogator anymore, but with the curiosity of a man watching a rare specimen. The boss is reweaving the web, but a web needs more than just silk. It needs eyes that can see the vibrations before the predator arrives. He stopped at a heavy oak door and turned to her. Kim Cho thought she was the smartest person in the room because she was the most beautiful. She forgot that the most dangerous person is the one everyone ignores.
Yolanda looked back toward the library, where the light spilled out onto the marble floor. She felt the weight of her father's diplomat-taught wisdom pressing against her chest. She had stepped out of her invisibility to save a life, but in doing so, she had walked directly into the gears of a machine that never stopped turning. The shadow of the wife was fading, but the shadow of the empire was just beginning to lengthen over her. The golden hour in Seoul cast long amber shadows across the terrace of the villa, but the warmth of the sun didn't touch the air between Yolanda and Kyung Cho. He stood at the edge of the stone railing, his back to her, looking out over the city, as if it were a chessboard he was currently resetting. He had replaced his navy suit with a charcoal gray cashmere sweater, yet he looked no less lethal. The change in fabric only made him seem more like a predator in winter fur. "You've been here a week, Yolanda," he said, his voice carrying on the light breeze. "My men tell me you spend your time watching the gate. You track the shift changes. You know which guards take their coffee black and which ones check their phones when they think Kang isn't looking." Yolanda didn't flinch. She stood 3 paces behind him, her posture still carrying the disciplined grace of the lounge Onyx. "It's a habit," she replied simply. "Invisibility requires knowing where the light doesn't reach." Kyung turned, and for the first time, he wasn't looking at her as a curiosity or a debt to be paid. He was looking at her as a solution. He stepped toward a small marble table where 2 glasses and a folder lay. I have paid your debts. Your visa is no longer a question, and your bank account is full enough that you could fly to Paris tomorrow and never look back, he said, his dark eyes searchingly deep. That was the reward for my life, but now I want to talk about your future. He opened the folder. Inside were photographs of high-end galleries, underground casinos, and diplomatic galas, places where the air was thick with the same hidden malice Yolanda had sensed at the restaurant. My face is a map of my sins, Yolanda, Kyung said, gesturing to the tattoos that marked his throat. I cannot enter these rooms without the air freezing. I cannot hear the whispers because my presence turns them into silence. But you, he paused, his gaze intensifying, you are the ghost. You are the woman people forget is in the room until the water glass is refilled. You see the mirrors. You see the signals. He leaned in, the scent of sandalwood and cold iron clinging to him. I don't want a waitress. I want an observer. I need eyes in the places I am too famous or too feared to go. You would be my silent partner. You would walk into the dens of my enemies, and you would simply notice.
Yolanda felt a thrill of terror, but beneath it a strange, resonant pulse of recognition. This was what her father had prepared her for, even if he hadn't known it. He had taught her to read the world so she wouldn't be crushed by it. Now Kyung was offering her the chance to own the room instead of just serving it. It's a different kind of service, Kyung continued, his voice dropping to a low, persuasive velvet. No more aprons, no more tips, just the truth. You tell me who is signaling the snipers before they pull the trigger, and I ensure that no one ever looks down on you again. Yolanda looked at the city below, its lights beginning to flicker on like 1,000 predatory eyes. She could take the money and run, remaining a ghost in someone else's story. Or she could step into the light and become the one who controlled the shadows. "When do I start?" she asked. Chung's mouth didn't move, but his eyes sparked with a dark, triumphant satisfaction. "You already have." The transition happened not in a moment of loud celebration, but in the quiet, clinical atmosphere of a high-end boutique in Gangnam, closed to the public for her arrival. Yolanda stood before a triptych of mirrors, watching as two tailors adjusted the fall of a charcoal silk blazer over her shoulders. The fabric was so light it felt like a second skin, a far cry from the heavy, starch-stiffened cotton of her waitress uniform. Gone was the bow tie that had felt like a tether. In its place was a delicate gold chain, a gift from Kyung that sat against her collarbone like a mark of ownership and protection. She looked at her reflection and realized that the invisible observer had been replaced by a visible enigma. In her black and white uniform, she had been part of the architecture, a shadow that moved plates. In these silks, she was someone people would look at, but they would see only what the clothes permitted: wealth, status, and a cool, untouchable grace. "The fit is perfect," Kang said, standing by the door, his reflection appearing in the mirror behind her. He held a small leather case containing her new credentials, a name that wasn't quite hers, a history that had been polished to a shine, and an invitation to a private auction at the Lotte Hotel. "You look like you belong in the rooms you're about to enter. That is your new armor." Yolanda smoothed the silk over her hips. She felt a strange pang of mourning for the waitress she had been, the woman who could disappear into the steam of a kitchen or the bustle of a dining room. That woman had been safe in her insignificance. This new version of herself, wrapped in the finery of the elite, was a target. She was no longer a ghost. She was a player. She practiced the walk Kyung had requested, not the hurried, efficient stride of a server, but the slow, deliberate pace of a woman who expects the world to wait for her. She realized that while her clothes had changed, her father's lessons remained her true foundation.
The attentive nature she had used to track water levels would now be used to track the movement of assets and the shifting of loyalties. As she stepped out of the boutique and into the waiting black sedan, the cool Seoul air felt different. It no longer carried the scent of the street. It carried the metallic, sharp tang of power. She looked at her hands, now manicured and devoid of the faint burns and calluses of restaurant work. She was no longer serving the elite. She was moving among them, a wolf in the finest sheep's clothing. The transformation was complete. The waitress was dead, and in her place stood Kyung Cha's most dangerous secret, draped in silk and fueled by the silence she had finally learned to weaponize. The north wing of the villa was a place where the sun seemed to lose its warmth before it touched the floor. Yolanda walked down the long, hollow corridor, the rhythmic click of her designer heels on the marble sounding like the ticking of a clock. She no longer wore the white shirt of a servant. She was draped in a midnight blue silk wrap that shimmered like deep water. In her hand, she carried a small tray with a single porcelain cup of tea, a final, ironic echo of her old life. She stopped before a heavy door guarded by one of Kyung's silent sentries. He nodded to her, not with the dismissive glance he'd give a waitress, but with the deferential lowered head reserved for Kyung's inner circle. The lock clicked, and Yolanda stepped inside. Kim Cha sat by the window, the once vibrant red off-shoulder dress now wrinkled and dull. Her long black hair, which had once cascaded like silk waterfall, was matted and neglected. She didn't look up. The elegance and poise that had defined her at the lounge onyx had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell of a woman who had gambled an empire and lost. Yolanda placed the tea on the small side table. The clink of the porcelain finally drew Kyung's gaze. "You," Kyung whispered, her voice raspy from days of silence. She looked at Yolanda's silk dress, then at the gold chain glinting at her throat. A bitter, jagged smile touched her lips, a crimson ghost of her former beauty. The ghost who learned to walk. "I was never a ghost," Yolanda said, her voice calm and resonant in the small room. "I was just the only one in the room who was actually looking." Kyung let out a short, dry laugh. "And look at you now. You think you've won? You think because he draped you in silk and gave you a seat at the table you're safe? You've just traded a small cage for a larger one. He'll use you until your eyes aren't sharp anymore, and then you'll end up in a room just like this."
Yolanda looked at the woman who had tried to have her husband executed over a dinner of grilled meat and fine wine. She felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of the sniper's barrel glinting in the Seoul night. "The difference between us, Kim, is that I know exactly where the exits are," Yolanda replied. She leaned in, her shadow falling over the fallen queen. "You saw this world as a prize to be stolen. I see it as a language to be mastered. You used your beauty to blind people. I used my invisibility to see them. I didn't trade one cage for another. I walked out of the gallery and into the frame." Kim's crimson smile faded, replaced by a cold, haunting realization. She saw in Yolanda's eyes the same icy calculation that lived in Kyung's, a steel trap intelligence that had successfully navigated the dangerous world Yolanda once only watched from the sidelines.
Yolanda turned and walked toward the door. She didn't look back at the shadow and the red dress. As she stepped out into the hallway, she felt the weight of her new life, the risks, the power, and the absolute clarity of her position. She wasn't just a survivor. She was the architect of her own destiny. The door locked behind her with a final, definitive thud, and Yolanda Peterside walked toward the light of the main hall, ready to see what the rest of the world was trying to hide.